Before we begin, if you're listening to this alone at night, you're exactly where you should be. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more true horror stories, disturbing encounters, and unexplained events uploaded every day. Now lock your doors, turn off the lights, and let's get into tonight's stories. Every campground has numbered campsites. You reserve one. You check in. You pitch your tent. Simple. Every site appears on the park map. Every road has a marker. Every trail leads somewhere. That's why what happened during one camping trip still doesn't make sense. I followed a small gravel road looking for my reserved campsite. Instead, I found Site 37. The problem was, according to the ranger, the campground only had 36 campsites. This happened during the fall of 2023. I planned a solo weekend camping trip in a heavily forested state park in northern Michigan. Nothing extreme. Just 2 nights away from work. No cell service. No traffic. Only hiking during the day and a campfire at night. I arrived shortly before sunset. The ranger at the entrance handed me a paper map. My reservation was for Site 18. He circled it with a pen. "Stay on the main campground road," he said. "Don't follow the old service road." I assumed he meant maintenance vehicles. Reasonable enough, at least initially. After unloading my gear, I realized I'd forgotten firewood. The campground store had already closed. I remembered passing a small pile of bundled wood near the entrance. Rather than walking, I decided to drive back. On the way, I noticed another narrow gravel road branching into the woods. A faded wooden sign leaned beside it. Only one word remained readable. Campground. No arrow. No numbers. Just the word. Curiosity got the better of me. I drove slowly onto the road. Within minutes, I passed a wooden post. Site 34. Then another. Site 35. Then, Site 36. I expected the road to end. Instead, another sign appeared. Site 37. My stomach tightened. The campsite looked occupied. A campfire burned steadily. A canvas tent stood beneath tall pine trees. An old pickup truck rested beside the fire ring. Everything looked ordinary, except there wasn't a single sound. No voices. No crackling fire. No insects. Nothing. I stepped out of my car. The air smelled strongly of wood smoke. Fresh coffee. Wet pine needles. A man wearing an old flannel jacket sat beside the fire. He looked to be in his 60s. Gray beard. Worn boots. Tin coffee cup resting in one hand. He smiled politely. "You're late. I think I took the wrong road." He nodded. "Everyone says that." I laughed nervously. "Is this Site 37? He looked toward the campsite marker, then quietly replied, "It is tonight." Something about the answer made every hair on my arms stand up. I asked if he knew the quickest way back to the main campground. He pointed deeper into the trees, not toward the road I'd driven in on. "That way's shorter." Every instinct told me not to follow. I thanked him, returned to my car, turned around. When my headlights swept across the campsite one last time, the fire had gone out. The chair was empty. The pickup truck had disappeared. Only the campsite marker remained. It no longer read 37. It read 18. I slammed on the brakes, got out again, looked closer. The numbers were carved directly into the wood. Not painted, not scratched over. Exactly the number of my reserved campsite. I drove back to the campground, reached my actual campsite less than 3 minutes later. My tent stood exactly where I'd left it. Everything looked normal. Mostly. That night, around 2:30 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps circling my tent. Slow, measured, never rushing. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Always just outside the fabric. I grabbed my flashlight. The footsteps stopped immediately. I unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. Nothing. The campfire had burned down to glowing coals. The campground remained silent. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard a man's voice. Calm, almost conversational. Wrong campsite. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sounded close enough to be standing behind the nearest tree. I stayed inside until sunrise. The next morning, I walked to the ranger station, asked whether the campground had ever included a Site 37. The ranger became unusually quiet, then asked, "Did you see the old pickup?" I hadn't mentioned the truck. He sighed. Years earlier, before the campground expanded, an older loop of campsites had existed beyond the service road. After repeated flooding, the entire section was permanently closed. The roads were removed, the campsite numbers reassigned. Officially, Site 37 had never existed in the current campground. Mostly, before leaving the park, I checked my dashcam footage. The recording showed me turning onto the gravel road, passing Site 34, Site 35, Site 36. Then, the video skipped ahead 12 minutes. The next frame showed my SUV parked quietly beside my own campsite, Site 18. There was no footage of Site 37. No campfire. No old man. Nothing. I still enjoy camping. I still visit remote parks. But if I ever see a campsite number that doesn't belong on the map, I keep driving. Because sometimes, the campsite that looks the most welcoming is the one that was closed, for reasons nobody talks about anymore. When you're camping alone, you notice every little change. A branch that wasn't there before. Fresh footprints near your tent. The sound of something moving outside the firelight. That's normal. Your brain pays attention because you're alone. For years, I took solo camping trips across state parks and national forests. Most nights were peaceful. Read a book, watch the fire, go to sleep. Then one weekend, every morning I woke up. There was one more chair sitting around my campfire. The strange part wasn't the chairs. It was that I only owned one. This happened during the spring of 2024. I had reserved a primitive campsite inside a remote section of a national forest in northern Wisconsin. No electricity, no running water, just a fire ring, a picnic table, and enough space for one tent. Exactly what I wanted. The nearest occupied campsite was almost half a mile away, perfect for a quiet weekend. I arrived just before sunset, set up my tent, collected firewood, cooked dinner. Nothing unusual. I brought one folding camping chair, placed it beside the fire, read until almost midnight, then climbed into my tent. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a faint metallic sound, almost like someone gently dragging something across gravel. I listened. The sound stopped. Probably an animal. Reasonable explanation, at least initially. The next morning, I stepped outside. A second camping chair sat opposite mine. Old, green canvas, rusty aluminum frame. I stared at it for several seconds. The chair looked weathered, not like something recently purchased. I walked around the campsite. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. The nearest campers insisted they hadn't been near my site. I assumed someone had left the chair months earlier and I'd somehow overlooked it. Mostly. That evening, I folded both chairs, leaning them against the picnic table. I stayed awake later than usual, watching the fire, listening to the woods. Around 1 a.m., I finally went to sleep. Just before dawn, the same scraping sound returned. Slow, metal against gravel. Closer this time, I unzipped the tent slightly. The fire had almost gone out. Moonlight illuminated the campsite. No movement, only silence. Morning arrived. There were now 3 chairs around the fire, perfectly spaced, as though 3 people had spent the evening talking. My stomach tightened. I packed one chair into my SUV, drove to the campground dumpster, threw it away. When I returned, 3 chairs still surrounded the fire. The one I'd discarded sat exactly where it had been before. I didn't understand how that was possible. Later that afternoon, I hiked to the ranger station. The ranger listened quietly, then asked, "Are they all facing the fire?" I hadn't mentioned that. He nodded slowly. Years earlier, before modern campsites were built, an old backcountry campground had occupied that section of forest. Large groups often gathered around shared fires. Eventually, the campground closed after repeated storm damage. Most traces disappeared. Mostly, that night, I decided not to sleep. I placed fresh logs on the fire, made coffee, sat watching the clearing. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2, nothing. Around 2:43 a.m., the forest became unnaturally quiet. The crackling fire seemed louder than before. Then, I heard it, a chair scraping across gravel. Behind me, very slowly. I turned immediately. No one, but one empty chair. was still moving, only an inch, then another, sliding closer to the fire. My breathing became shallow. Another chair shifted, then another, until all three formed a perfect circle around the flames. One seat remained empty. Directly across from me, a fourth chair slowly emerged from the darkness beyond the trees, dragging itself. No hands, no person, just the sound of aluminum scraping across stone. It stopped beside the others, leaving only one place still occupied. Mine. Every instinct told me not to stay seated. I stood immediately, back toward my tent. The moment I stepped away, the fourth chair slid into my place, facing the fire, as though someone invisible had just sat down. The campfire suddenly flared brighter. For just a second, I thought I saw shadows, not moving through the woods, sitting quietly in the chairs, watching the flames. I didn't wait to find out. I threw my gear into the SUV, left everything else behind, even the cooler. The next morning, I returned with a ranger. The campsite looked completely ordinary. One fire ring, one picnic table, one folding chair. Mine. Nothing else. The ranger smiled politely, suggested I hadn't slept well. Reasonable explanation. Mostly. Before leaving, I glanced toward the fire ring, for shallow impressions circled the ashes, exactly where the chairs had stood. Months later, I received a phone call from the park office. They had found my camping permit attached to the reservation file. The ranger asked one question. "When you left, did you take your chair?" I told him yes. He became quiet, then said, "That's strange. We found 4 of them. I never asked where. I've camped many times since, usually with friends now, never alone. And whenever we build a campfire, I always count the chairs before going to sleep. Because if there's ever one more than there should be, I'm not staying long enough to see who it's waiting for." Most campers eventually get used to sleeping in a tent. The wind shakes the fabric. Rain taps against the roof. Small animals wander through the campsite. None of it bothers you after enough trips. What never becomes normal is waking up because your tent is opening by itself. Not ripping, not blowing open in the wind. Unzipping, slowly, one tooth at a time, every night, at exactly 3:17 a.m. The strange part wasn't that it kept happening. It was that my trail camera never recorded anyone outside. This happened during the summer of 2023. I had planned a 4-day solo camping trip inside a remote section of a national forest in western Montana. No developed campground, no nearby roads, just a designated backcountry campsite beside a small lake. The nearest ranger station was almost 12 miles away, exactly the kind of isolation I enjoyed. The hike took most of the afternoon. I reached the lake just before sunset, set up my backpacking tent beneath a line of pine trees, collected water, built a small campfire, cooked dinner. Everything felt peaceful. Around 10 that night, I climbed into my sleeping bag. Within minutes, I was asleep. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I woke. Not because of a sound, because of cold air. The tent door stood open, only 6 inches. The zipper rested halfway down. I frowned. Maybe I hadn't closed it completely. Reasonable enough, at least initially. I zipped it shut, checked it twice, went back to sleep. The following morning, nothing looked unusual. No footprints, no torn fabric, no missing gear. That evening, I paid closer attention. I completely closed the zipper, pulled both zipper tabs together, even tied them with a short piece of paracord. There was no way the door could accidentally slide open. At 3:17 a.m., I woke again. Cold air. The tent door stood open. The paracord still tied the zipper pulls together. Yet somehow, the zipper had opened beneath the knot. I sat frozen inside the tent, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. Only distant water gently moving across the lake. Morning arrived. Still no tracks. The ground around my tent remained untouched. That afternoon, I hiked back to my truck, retrieved a trail camera, mounted it to a nearby tree, pointed directly at the tent entrance. If something visited during the night, I'd finally know. Darkness fell. The forest became quiet. The fire slowly burned down. I stayed awake until almost 2:30. Eventually, sleep won. At exactly 3:17, I woke again. The zipper moved. Not quickly. Slowly. 1 inch. Then another. The tiny metal teeth separated with a soft scraping sound. I watched it happen. No hand touched the zipper. Nothing stood outside. When the opening reached about 8 inches, the movement stopped. Something blocked the moonlight beyond the opening. Not a shape. Not a person. Just darkness. Darker than everything else. It remained there for several seconds. Then, it moved away. The zipper never closed. I didn't sleep again. As soon as daylight arrived, I checked the trail camera. The recording showed my tent exactly as expected. The timestamp read 3 hours 16 minutes and 58 seconds. Nothing happened. Then, at 3 hours and 17 minutes, the video froze. 3 seconds later, the recording resumed. The zipper already stood open. No movement. No visitor. Nothing. Only 3 missing seconds. The next afternoon, I hiked to a small fire lookout where a seasonal ranger happened to be working. I mentioned the strange zipper, trying to laugh it off. The ranger didn't smile. Instead, he quietly asked, 3:17? I hadn't mentioned the time. He looked out toward the trees for a long moment, then explained that years earlier, before the area became a designated backcountry zone, an old search and rescue camp had operated near the lake. One volunteer reportedly disappeared during a nighttime search. According to the radio log, his final transmission came at exactly 3:17 a.m. After that, only static. The search never found him. Eventually, the temporary camp was removed. Officially, nothing remained. Mostly, I decided to leave one day early. Packed everything before sunset. Planned to hike out at first light. That final night, I didn't even light a campfire. I stayed inside the tent, headlamp off, listening. At 3:17, the zipper began opening again. This time, it continued all the way. The tent door folded completely aside. The forest outside looked perfectly still. Then, a flashlight beam swept silently between the trees. Once, twice, 3 times, exactly like someone searching. A man's voice drifted through the darkness. Calm, distant. Found you. The flashlight immediately went dark. I never looked outside. I waited for sunrise without moving. The next morning, I packed in record time. Started hiking. Never looked back at the campsite. About 2 miles down the trail, I met another backpacker heading toward the lake. We talked for a minute. Then he casually asked, "Did somebody camp with you last night?" I shook my head. "No." He looked confused. "That's strange. When I passed your campsite before sunrise, I thought I saw someone standing beside your tent." I didn't answer, just kept walking. When I reached home, I reviewed the trail camera footage one last time, frame by frame. Just before the video froze, I noticed something I'd missed before. At the very edge of the frame, barely visible between 2 trees, stood the faint outline of a person, holding a flashlight, looking directly toward my tent. The timestamp read 3 hours 16 minutes and 59 seconds. 1 second before the recording disappeared. I still camp, just not alone anymore. And every night before I go to sleep, I check the tent zipper one last time. Not because I think it might accidentally come open, but because if I ever wake up at exactly 3:17, and it's already open, I'm not going to look outside to see who opened it.